Hi everyone, I'm Cheryl Mahoney and I blog at marveloustales.com about books and writing. Today I'm talking about Anne of the Island by L.M. Montgomery. It is book 3 of the Anne of Green Gables series. Generally when I tell people that my favorite author is L.M. Montgomery, I have to clarify she's the one who wrote Anne of Green Gables, and that's what everybody knows. I don't think they necessarily know that Anne of Green Gables is book 1 of an 8-book series. So if you're here to find out about book 3, I assume you're interested in a fair depth of information about this series or this author. So as I said, book 3 is what we're discussing today. Book 1 saw Anne grow from a heedless, prone to scrapes child into a mature young woman. Book 2 was all about Anne's time as a school teacher in Avonlea, and she continued to be a mature young woman. Not quite as interesting as when she was still getting into scrapes. Book 3 is when Anne goes off to college. Now, I think it's interesting comparing the covers, actually. Anne looks way more like staid and matronly, actually, in book 2. Book 3, she looks a little more windswept and romantic and younger, actually, oddly. And I think the covers are actually a pretty good reflection for the book, in that book 3, I think Anne is a more interesting character than she is in book 2, because she's exploring new things in college, she gets into a romance or two, and it's a little more exciting than quite how mature and calm and a little bit perfect she was in book 2. So I enjoy book 3. I think Anne of the Island is a good installment in the series, and I also particularly enjoy these supporting characters. To be perfectly honest, Anne's friends in the earlier 2 books were not that appealing as characters, I find, personally. Book 1 introduced us to Diana Barry, who is Anne's devoted bosom friend forever and is like the famous one. Diana's okay. She's nice. She's lovely. She'd be lovely to have as a friend, but she's not very imaginative. And there's just, she's a loyal, devoted friend to Anne, who is a loyal and devoted friend to her. There's not a lot more in there. A story that was about Diana, I can't actually picture that. I don't think there'd be much to do there if you didn't have Anne, you know? Likewise, Anne went away to school. It was sort of the high school equivalent and to get her teacher's credential. In book 1, she met Priscilla Grant and Stella, I can't remember Stella's last name. Oh well, that's okay, because neither of them are very developed characters either. There's actually very little of them in book 1. They come back in book 3. They go to college with Anne. They're nice girls. There's not a lot to them. But fortunately, book 3 introduces us to Philippa Gordon, who is a much more interesting character and a lot more fun. Philippa comes from wealth, but is not too proud on account of that. She also is hopeless at making up her mind, which gives you a lot of comedy. And she is just a more interesting supporting character. And she's very smart, acts very shallow, is not actually that shallow, but can't quite let go of that veneer of shallowness. She's hopelessly undecided about whether to marry Alec or Alonzo, both 2 very nice boys, and she just can't choose between them. There's a lot more here, and Philippa is really a excellent addition to the series and a more exciting and entertaining friend for Anne. I feel like you can see Montgomery trying to introduce more interesting characters because she can't quite do as much with Anne as she did in book 1, now that Anne is a mature young lady. And as I mentioned in the previous review, Montgomery felt she had to treat young ladies with a certain degree of reverence, or at least that the public demanded it. So she couldn't make Anne as comical and entertaining as she had been before. She does get Anne into a few, I don't know if scrapes is the word, awkward situations, let's say. Many of them around romance. Montgomery also mentioned she didn't like writing sentiment, or she didn't feel she was good at writing sentiment, which is strange because she did it so much and she was good at it as far as I could tell. But you can kind of see her trying to write romance because she felt she had to, but trying to do it her own way and not make it perhaps the sentimental romance that people were expecting her to be writing. Anne gets several marriage proposals in this. The first three, I just read this, you'd think I know. Three, she gets three very awkward marriage proposals from people she would never have considered marrying or ever expected to propose to her. And so we get some comedy out of romance, actually. We get some tragedy in this book as well. Anne's friend Ruby Gillis has consumption. Not to be flip, but they all had consumption, didn't they, in books of the time? And so she sort of quietly fades away, but it's really, I think, about Anne's growth in this, of recognizing what's happening to Ruby and making new decisions about her own life through that. So there is some deeper, darker, tragic notes in the book as well. Some of the characters from the previous book come back a little bit. Anne is away at college, but she does go back to Green Gables, so Davy and Dora, the twins, are still around. Not a lot of screen time for Davy, but a little bit, I think. Paul Irving is back. I mentioned liking him in book 2. There's one slightly heartbreaking line about how Paul Irving is quite a big boy now, young man in fact, and is more interested in football than fairies. And I'm like, what? No, that's not the Paul Irving we met. But he's still a kindred spirit to Anne, and kindred spirits know no time and no ages, and it doesn't matter. And I think Paul still goes on to be a poet, probably. We'll assume. I'd like to think so. Gilbert Blythe is still in this story. Anne's obviously intended romance. But again, you can kind of see Montgomery not really wanting to write that romance because they spend most of the book apart. Gilbert proposes fairly early on. Anne turns him down flat because Anne spends almost the entire book sure that she can only be friends with Gilbert. Really, we can only be friends, just friends. So sure about this. Yeah. So they spend a big chunk of the book not together, and Gilbert is actually kind of shuffled off the screen because he can't even be all that good of a friend because things are super awkward now, obviously. And Anne gets into a different romance. And I think, again, Montgomery was kind of playing at what the romance was supposed to look like and inverting the expectations a little bit. Because Anne meets her ideal, her dark-eyed, dreamy, sort of despondent hero of romance, who then she ends up finding out she actually doesn't love and can't love, and his own sister says there's not much interesting about him, which is really kind of harsh, I gotta say. But I think Montgomery was deliberately sort of writing the classic romance hero and then just sort of puncturing that little illusion about how much fun he would be, which is fair because really, well, I like Mr. Tilney in Austen novels because he smiles and he dances and he makes jokes. Mr. Darcy would actually be probably really difficult to live with. And I think that's the kind of thing that Montgomery is sort of approaching in the way she writes Anne's romance. Have no fear, it's okay. She does not marry off Anne by the end, but she does get engaged to Gilbert. Montgomery said in her journal she knew she'd have to do that. I don't know that she exactly didn't want to, but she certainly felt she had to. And it does happen, and that is where the story ends. And you can kind of feel that it was probably supposed to end at 3. There's 5 more. Book 4, Montgomery actually didn't write until much later. Book 5 was the next one written. Things happen. It's sort of like Narnia. That one got written out of chronological order too. But you can kind of feel that this one also was in some ways meant to wrap up the Anne story. So it's a good story. It ties up a lot of things at the end. And it's satisfying. I enjoy this one. I think it's better than book 2 that I recently reviewed. It may not be as good as book 1 because book 1 is a lot of fun and the most comical, I think, of the entire series. But book 3 is good, especially because of Philippa Gordon. She adds a lot to the story, but the college scene is kind of fun as well. So that was book 3 out of 8. I'm going to try and come back and review the others too. I need to finish rereading them though. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have more reviews in the future. In the meantime, thank you for watching. And again, my name is Cheryl Mahoney. I blog at marvelous tales.com.